story element. We also took the context on the south side of the property as well, as we looked at exploring making certain we could provide usable, functional space with this new building. This middle donut hole inevitably came out. As we stood on the vacant parking lot and looked to the east, you've got these wonderful stepped and terraced mountains. As we look to the west, we've got wonderful stepped and terraced buildings. The design team thought it would be appropriate that this building also mimicked some of that same design, stepping, terracing. And so intentionally and very specifically, certain corners of the building were taken out. On the south facade, in order to accommodate a pedestrian walkway, we exceeded the side yard setback by 5 feet. So we reduced this side of the building by 5 feet. On the north side of the building, as we looked at getting a drive, meandering drive into the north side of this building, it required the removal of 6 feet of the north side of this building. And instead of trying to allow the parking lot to come in and then push the building back out to the side yard setback, we said, we'll work with this. We'll address this 6 feet. So that 6 feet was removed on the north facade. That left us with this cube. That's where a lot of time and effort and energy was then spent with Architectural Nexus to make certain that we were addressing the standards of the ordinance. The wonderful thing about city staff is that you didn't see the first 3 attempts that we brought to Lex that were denied, that needed attention, needed addressing. And that's really the process that we went through. This is a quick aerial site plan showing the site. So you can see again the 21-foot setback, 6 feet greater than required on the north side to get the drive off of 6th East. You can see the sidewalk, the meandering walkway, the 20-foot setback here. You can see the 25-foot deep product on the south side to create what then becomes in excess of 45 feet at a 2-story height along the south facade of the building. And you can see here on the west facade of the building a 35-foot deep 2-story brownstone product that you'll see. So together with the 25-foot setback, we're more than 60 feet of depth from the sidewalk. This is a required fire ingress, egress, hammerhead turnaround for aerial apparatus for the building. And as we looked at the MU, we thought the only thing that will draw someone to the middle of this block is something of interest. And so the intent and part of the certificate of appropriateness would be the relocation of the carriage house back into this corner, ultimately creating it into something that is a nod to the Masons, what was here, what has been here, what they've created. And I apologize, a lot of this line weight I know on the screen doesn't come through super well. We've got some printed copies that we'll hand out, but we've got, per your kind of request last time, we looked at the streetscape along 600 East. So the Masonic Temple itself, the Walker McCarthy Mansion adjacent to it, this property, this section is in that first 60 feet, so it's at the 2-story volume. So I want to make certain that's very clear, but you can see the volume of this building as it relates to even some of the larger single-family homes to the south of it. This is, hey, Meek, if you want to hand these out, this is hot off the press. This is some strong encouragement and suggestion from individuals in the community, Lex as well. Again, appreciate all that Lex has done. We printed these because I knew this line weight on this TV might not come up. This might be a better image to click to, but you have this packet. And Meekna can correct me if I'm wrong. This is standing on the sidewalk with a camera held at 5 foot 9 inches high, looking through a 35-foot space between the property owned by the Simnani organization and the Walker McEwen Mansion. The reason the line weight in the background back here appears small and low is the facade, the north facade of our building is in excess of 220 feet from where this picture was taken, from the sidewalk. Roads, cars, vehicles traveling in South Temple are obviously another 20, 30, 40 feet into the street. This lower picture is a glimpse looking through the 35 feet between the Simnani office building and the Masonic Temple itself. And you can see the height of the northeast corner of our building through that 35-foot shot and glimpse. We felt this was important. We had been asked to do it, and so wanted to prepare that. Couple of elevations and renderings. You can see the trees and the heights along, or the height of those trees along 600 East. Many of those are incredible. They're phenomenal. They exceed even the height of this building, not just the two-story elements, but the entirety of the height of this building. A couple of those renderings from different angles, aerials from different angles. We'll get into this here. You've seen this, most of this, some of the south, northeast elevations, some of the materiality. Down on the first floor in the brownstones, making certain that we've got aluminum storefront doors and windows. We've got brick facade. This two-story volume space in these brownstones and the pedestrian connection that they create along this street is absolutely of the most paramount importance to us. It also creates setbacks, an additional 25, an additional 30 feet before the building of any height or significant rises. And it pushes that mass and volume to the middle of the block, closer to the Masonic Temple itself that exceeds all buildings in this area. And when we were before this body before, one of the questions that was asked was this north facade. This is the north facade, and this is after the 6-foot additional setback that we looked at. These numbers might be a little harder to see. The window reveal design is a 4-inch reveal. You've got 18-inch and 2'6", so 28-inch reveals with 5-foot balconies. This facade has fenestration articulation. It has push and pull. It's not a long, sterile wall. It's got movement. It's got motion. We're looking at this as 4-sided architecture. We presented the 600 East facade to you in our work session, and one of the questions was, is this stepping and pushing and pulling consistent around the building? And we wanted to show you that it is. One of the other questions that, this is the southeast corner, so again, down along 600 East, you can see again those 4 step backs, the 5-foot reveals up higher for some of the balconies, the 4-inch window reveals and that creation. One of the things that we had talked about is this 15-foot depth. And you had asked us to specifically kind of look at that. We talked about the stepping of this landscaping, the opportunity to create planters, separation from the sidewalk and the building, these patios, an area where people can congregate. So again, these numbers might be smaller for you. Sidewalk line is here, over 6 feet back to the actual property line itself. 7 feet from there back to the first phase of this landscape box. This landscape box is 3 feet deep to allow for grasses and low growies and other elements. And then a 15-foot patio or setback from here back to the start of the 2-story brownstones. And then the 2-story brownstones themselves, this element is 35 feet deep before any of the other mass and height starts. That's where that 60 feet of depth from the property line is. In excess of 60 feet from the sidewalk itself, because the property line starts further east than the sidewalk. One of the other questions was the trees. We know there are significant trees. Certainly any of the trees in the 600 East right-of-way, we want and fully expect to implement a tree protection zone as required by the ordinance. There are 2 trees that are on this property inside between the sidewalk and the parking lot itself. There are 2 trees that we know will be lost in this process. We are identifying those. There are 2 more that, depending on the depth of excavation and footing, we may lose. Regardless, and as part of this packet and certificate of appropriateness, we're proposing the installation of 7 new trees behind the sidewalk, between our property, the patios, the sidewalk itself, to replace those 4. Additionally, along the pedestrian mew, we're looking at another 10 to 12 trees in this concept. And furthermore, for the softening of the east side of the building and the softening of the remaining parking lot, we're looking at the new introduction of trees back in that area along the drive for the fire aerial apparatus access. With that, I'll turn some time over to Meekna to talk specifically about the form of the building and how we came to the form of the building.
Thank you, Dustin. And as you've already alluded, we've been working with Lex extensively to create a narrative that addresses all 86 design standards out of the multifamily design and historic districts. And I'm not going to touch on every one of those, but you'll have access to that narrative. I'll just touch on 2 or 3 items that I think are the most important. One is the dark brick, that is a direct reference to the historically contributing building to the south. The other significant item that we've been working on is, and Dustin's already alluded to this in the massing, but the transition between the larger massing of the buildings on South Temple and the smaller residential single-family and multifamily buildings to the south on 600 East. And we're doing that through by interrupting the dark brick with some areas of lighter brick in order to break down the facade further into masses that relate to the buildings to the south. The additional materials, for example, the cementitious board that we're using as a highlight, that's similar to the way that cast stone would have been used on a traditional brick building in this district and in this neighborhood. And then the tripartite organization of the buildings, they typically have 3 planes, 2 of which project forward or hold back, and then the third is the entry, and we're taking a modern interpretation of that tripartite organization into this more contemporary building. It's interesting to note, for example, the residential building to the south has an asymmetry to that organization with a bay window and an entry that are kind of the entries on the left, and so we're using that in the entry to our building. There's other elements like the fenestration patterns. We've looked at the proportions of the windows down the street, and they have a 2-to-1 ratio and then a more square organization, and we've used both of those in our building, as well as the windows of the Masonic Temple that have a 1.25-to-2 ratio, and we've used that in our more vertically oriented windows. I'll stop there just so we're not getting into too much detail, but if anybody has any questions, we're happy to address them.
And I would say the same. If there's any questions, we're happy to address them. Otherwise, we'll sit down. We know there are members of the public here. We know that there's been written notice, some for, some against. We know there's been frustrations about the process. Some of that we don't control. I hope this commission understands that. There's been an overwhelming support recently or an overwhelming amount of support for the project that I think you've seen in some of the materials that have come in recently. So with that, we'll address any questions, and then we'll sit down and would appreciate a chance to address any comments or questions from the public.
Well, commissioners, questions for the applicant.
One of the written comments that we got this week made reference to the shadows that would be cast, particularly on the mansion. Have you done any studies, or do you have any input on what will happen in terms of the light?
I can answer that. Yes, we have looked at that, and the location of this site is actually, as Dustin mentioned, 10 feet lower than the mansion, and with the 20-foot setback that we have on that zone, and there's also a parking garage that's between this site and the mansion. There would not ever be any light or any shadows that would be cast on the mansion.
Can you remind me, I think this came up in the last meeting, why the west side was chosen? Is it because the east side of that parking lot is going to be used by the
Sure.
temple?
That's amazing that you ask that question because I raised my hand to address that because I saw that, that there was an email that said, why not 7th East? Because 7th East, of course, makes perfect sense. It's a main thoroughfare. When we were taking a look at what we were wanting to try and do, we've got an aging membership, and we knew that if we developed 7th East as opposed to 6th, now our members are walking through the winter all the way down from the 6th East portion, and we're not staffed appropriately to go out and retrieve all of our members. When I first joined the lodge, our average age was 67 years old. Again, thank you for Mr. Brown and his books. It's now downtrended to about 44 years old, but we still do have a pretty decent constituency of older members. So that's really specific for the reason why there's, at this point in time, no plan at all to do anything on the 7th East side. I can't say that a board 15 years from now might change their mind or anything along those lines, but that's the reason. Thank you.
Was it possible to create access at least from 7th East while maintaining the parking? Because I believe that was another large concern was the traffic that was going to be produced on 6th East.
I'll take that one. So I'm trying to get to a site plan so that I can address it. So to Jason's comment, one of the things when we got involved in this is making certain that we were providing 120, 130 parking stalls. Oh, there we go. Making certain we were providing those 120, 130 parking stalls for their events and having it be as close to the temple as possible. So obviously immediately south of the temple became that location. As to access, the temple itself, this access off of 600 East comes to a lower level that ultimately by the back eastern half of this parking level is fully subterranean. There is like 60 parking stalls on this level. That is the access for that level. There is an easement being granted not only to this building for access for residents, but also the fire department in perpetuity from South Temple down the west side of the temple to this hammerhead T that will also serve as a second point of ingress and egress to the second parking level. So the brownstones on both the west and south side screen that parking structure in its entirety. The approximate story and a half of parking on the north side is adjacent to a story and a half of a parking structure. And on the east facade, you'll have one level of parking and then the 4 stories of residential space above that. Granting a long-term permanent easement and access across here was not something the board was willing to do. I think that knowing there's 2 curb cuts, the high likelihood and probability is that it still provides a means right now until something were to happen 15 years, 50 years, don't know. At this, we certainly know that this property always has 2 points of ingress and egress for transportation needs.
You've been, in your design, I think, really deferential to the residential buildings to the south. What is your thinking with respect to the height on the north side as you entered the design process with regard to the neighboring buildings on South Temple?
So we talked through this, and we talked through it even with members of staff. Part of that and that deference, as you mentioned, these structures themselves are smaller 2-story structures. They're not as large as the structures to the north. Second point that was addressed, the property itself slopes to the southwest. So having more mass at the southwest would make it feel even bigger, even more significant down in this southwest corner. Third point that we looked at and addressed is this property in particular has a 10-foot side yard setback, our 20-foot side yard setback, and then our 25-foot 2-story product. It's 75 feet before you get into 3 and 4 stories on our building. These buildings to the north have a double-loaded drive aisle of parking that's 60 feet. They then own some property on the south side of the parking structure. We're also granting an additional 21 feet of setback. So we're in excess of 85, 90 feet from those structures themselves, excluding their parking, compared to 75 feet. So as we looked at it, we were trying with staff to create kind of a narrow window that paid the same respects before the building went to 3 and 4 stories of height adjacent to those structures. In doing that, it also forced the building to get a little longer, more elongated into the block. But getting into the middle of the block was something that we heard multiple times was fine. We actually had a couple individuals suggest that we go and propose a full additional floor on the easternmost portion of this building. We're 50 feet, and zoning is 60, and so there was comment about taking this easternmost portion a whole additional level higher than what we're proposing.
You mentioned an easement. Is the easement on the Masonic property or on the Semnani property?
This easement is on the Masonic Temple property in perpetuity.
I'm not sure that I have any other questions. Anyone? Well, in that case, why don't we open the open portion of this public meeting? And what I'd like to do, since we have quite a few people who'd like to comment, is I'll ask someone to speak, and then I'll do my best to remember to say who's next so he can get prepared. So why don't we, if I could just ask Phil McCarthy to start, please.
Yeah.
What's that? Yeah, so we're going to, typically we do 2 minutes per speaker. Given the proximity of the property owned by Mr. McCarthy, I'd suggest, if it's okay with you, that we give him 5, and then we try and limit the remainder of the comments to 2. Mr. McCarthy?
Yeah, Mr. Chair, maybe after Mr. McCarthy speaks, we typically have the community, if there is a member of the community council available to come up first, but we have him. Yeah.
Good evening, and thank you for this opportunity to talk to you. I wanted to address the people who spoke with us earlier, and I can certainly sympathize with you. I know how expensive it is to maintain old buildings.
If you could speak into the microphone, I would really appreciate it. Thank you.
To the commission.
I know how expensive it is to maintain historic buildings. And just to make sure, the McCune Mansion was built in 1901. The building that you mistakenly referred to here is called Walker McCarthy. It was built by Matthew Walker in 1904. So we can have a lot of comments. We can do a couple of different things, but I needed to take exception to a couple of things. Here was the thing that came out in April 2019 that went to the City Council requesting a zoning change. While no specific physical development is under consideration in association with these applications, potential master plan and zoning amendment approvals would allow for residential office-type land use in the future. Less than 9 months later, we are here debating a project. We did hear from somebody also say, well, maybe we'll develop something on the 7th East Side over the next 40 or 50 years. I sympathize with the aging Masonic, clientele, but that's not the reason for the Historic Landmark Commission to destroy a truly historic area. There's plenty of room behind this Masonic temple on the 7th East Side. We're not going to destroy any of these trees. We're not going to destroy the historic nature of things. There's really only 3 things that we should be addressing here now. The first is they didn't get the information right. I sent you, Lex, I walked from the Masonic Temple to the edge of my property. It was 107 steps. I walked front door to front door. It was 178 steps. Yet no one ever came, knocked on the door, put anything under there, said, should we talk? Should we tell you what we're going to do here or something? There's a historic plaque on the building. In order to go around the corner to address this and put in here that on 610 East South Temple is the Broadway at Eccles building. Here it is. They're a tenant in a building. You would have to look very, very closely and really sort of go out of your way. Why would somebody mislabel and misrepresent the most historic property on there? It was built in 1904, 23 years before the Masonic Temple. The height restrictions. You've been told it will not be higher than the existing buildings to disturb those trees. Matthew Walker planted some of those trees in 1904. I have planted some of those. I don't remember which is which, but certainly it's going to disrupt those trees, and it is substantially higher, as you can see from their own diagram. The questions you need to ask yourself, if they misidentified this, they couldn't get this much right. The second thing would be the height. And the third thing really is the site. This is a historic district. If there is a need for Masonic Temple apartments off 7th East, whom would they be coming in front of? Their own people. The Masonic Temple would be saying, we are the Masonic Temple, and it might be blocking our view or changing some of those things. But we are adamantly opposed to this project. We were not included. We have seen things that have been mislabeled and misidentified. And after a few emails and calls, I noticed about 5 minutes after 6, suddenly something new has been given to you that I have not seen. I'm open to any questions, either from you or from anyone in the audience, if that helps.
Commissioners. Thank you, Mr. McCarthy.
I would just mention this. If the Historic Landmark Commission does not preserve these properties, you will forever discourage people from purchasing, protecting, and preserving these historic properties.
May I ask?
Please.
Do you have an opinion or a thought on how the project could respect everything that you're saying and move forward still?
Certainly. Just take all of the information, all the things I've had. You can move it right behind 7th East. There are no issues there. You're not interfering with any neighbors. Technically, no real historic district. And as we had mentioned through an intermediary, the area on 6th East would be maintained. We had talked to somebody from the Masons, and then we're told now that he is not the person who. You need green space. We would continue to put trees in there. We will put the park, the walkway. You can roller skate in there. You could take your kids for a walk. You could walk the dog in there. So certainly we have always said we would support that, whatever they want to do behind the Masonic Temple coming in off 7th East. If they need places to park, they need places to do some things while they were constructing that, we would have green space. We would have open space there. I've been there for 21 years. My intention is to be there for a few more.
Thank you. Anything else? Great. Since I skipped it initially, is there anyone from a community council that would like to present? Okay. Well then, let me ask Joseph Sanders to come on up, and after that we'll have Cindy Cromer.
Let me make sure you can hear me? Okay. Thank you for the opportunity, distinguished commission members. Jason, a mentor of mine that eloquently spoke of so many things that we do for the community and why the Masonic Temple is important. So I don't want to elaborate too much, but as a historian, you know, by nature and in my studies, I want to talk about the historical significance of that place, but also, you know, for future generations, for the right to enjoy the history and the leadership that's been cultivated throughout the history of that Masonic Temple. But I am a representative of one of the oldest lodges in Utah history, Mount Moriah Lodge number 2. We've been established in a cornerstone of this community since 1866. Briefly, members, early civic leaders, such as Christopher Dill, were, influential in creating the first Salt Lake City library system in our efforts to promote knowledge and community development and support our community, to former Supreme Court justices, which Calvin Bell, who was a distinguished member of the Utah Supreme Court and also a chief Nuremberg investigator that brought many people to justice. And so members of our lodge and also the Masonic family have been doing so many significant things, and that's what's alive in that building. And not only that spirit's alive in that building, but also in this community, it is a cornerstone of the South Temple District. Ironically, Masons, lay in the northeast corner, and that's the cornerstone of the northeast district of, South Temple and 7th East. And it's one of the only buildings in the city that was built in the 1920s that was dedicated to the Egyptian revival movement of that time, which was, was rampant throughout historic buildings. And it is representative, I think, not only of Masonic culture, but of the diversity of world culture that's, demonstrated in the symbolism in that building. And, from Gothic, Moorish traditions, and so that's been captured. It's a museum of priceless information, not only of the leaders and the archives of those individuals that are hosted there, the former, some of the initial remnants of the Salt Lake Library system, but also if we lost that, the land lease is what I'm in support of, is because it gives us a tool to keep this going on for another 100 years. I'm very...
Let's wrap it up. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you for your time.
Thank you. Cindy, and then next we'll have Todd Brashear.
There is a copy for each of you, starting with Wayne Mills. I don't know if my voice will hold up. If it fails, you'll have to read on your own. I want to start with the context for this proposal, this beleaguered block, which is in 2 historic districts. Due east is the site of a former Foursquare slightly damaged in a fire and then allowed to collapse through lack of enforcement and the wrong ownership. The former mayor overturned your decision, which was consistent with the ordinance. To the south of that, an adaptive reuse of a building burned in a fire. Next to that, a building called Annie's Cottage, which is really not Annie's Cottage because Annie's Cottage burned completely in a fire along with the garages for Madsonia Court. We lost 3 contributory structures in the early years of the Central City Historic District west of the Armstrong-Jones Mansion. Then there is the graffiti-encrusted Madsonia Court, which stands empty during a housing shortage. There was a gas leak there, and I thought we might lose the entire block. Skip over a few wonderful structures and you encounter a recent enforcement case, infill townhouses where the developer saw no reason to follow the plans you had approved. This block is the Peyton Place of preservation. Of course, it is wonderful that there will be reinvestment on this block, this beleaguered block, and even more wonderful that it will be housing which does not precipitate the demolition of existing housing or of any historic structures. The parking lot for the Masonic Temple is one of the largest expanses of asphalt west of the University of Utah. I am delighted that the plans include the relocation of the stable. Accessory structures are an endangered species in the preservation effort. Thank you.
Thank you, Cindy. Todd Brashear, and then we'll have Gary Evershed. Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay. Thank you for the opportunity to talk in opposition to this project. I have met with Jason and Justin, so the Masonic Temple representative and the developer, and I've listened to a lot of this. My issue is kind of more to your requirements for new construction in this historic district. And, you know, as I just go through each of the criteria, you know, this new construction is meant to, you know, kind of harmonize and complement the historic district that it's in. The buildings, the new construction should be similar in scale, size. The access to light within, you know, how it's affecting other properties, other historic structures, the property itself, upper floors that are massed and high, they're supposed to, you know, be stepped back. I notice here on what we all looked at, the developer took great pains to step back the south side and the west side of this building. And as you can clearly see, massed everything on the north and the east corners. And to the point, you know, if we look at the renderings that they have in the packet here, the height of the Walker-McCarthy mansion, once again, not the Walker-McCune mansion, the top gable is 40 feet high. This proposed development shows 60 feet. So that's 20 feet higher than the top of the gable. Talk about in a straight wall massed up like that, the view is going to be not so great from South Temple, not to mention that access to light, what it's going to do to the parking terrace for the Walker-McCarthy mansion and the Semnani property. I think you can see there is a three-story parking structure, the top level of that. I think Semnani's and the Walker-McCarthy is going to be a sheet of ice during the winter months because it will block out the sunlight. And contrary to what they indicated, I think they said it's going to be 10 feet lower than the mansion. It's going to be 20 feet higher, 10 feet lower than the Masonic Temple.
I know 2 minutes is short to the extent you can wrap
Okay.
up. Thank you.
So the real issue is the massing of it on the north side, and then, you know, why couldn't consideration for stepping back the building on the north side? You know, why did that get kind of short shift in this whole development? As I said, they took great pains for the south and the east side. And, you know, a couple other issues, the traffic flow, the cars that will be going out onto the 6th East side. I understand the city feels, or Lex tells us, the city feels no traffic study needs to be done. I'm not so sure of that with 125 cars at a minimum, most likely, if it's going to be 125 units. Understand, you know, they still have to go through the lot line adjustments, the parcel consolidation, because you can't even build this building on that lot as it stands right now.
Thank you.
Any questions or comments?
I mentioned Gary Evershed, but I just noticed that you checked that you did not wish to speak. Would you please submit a card? If you could submit a card, that would be terrific. If you could, that would be terrific. Thank you.
After the fact, is that okay?
Sure.
Thank you. I'm Max Smith. I've architected a number of these restorations on South Temple, Brigham Street, not to mention the McCarthy Mansion, Walker-McCarthy Mansion. It's the most important historic street in the state of Utah by any measure. The architects paid a lot of attention to 3 elevations, and then they gave us the north elevation, which is the backdrop for these historic buildings, especially McCarthy Mansion, off South Temple, off Brigham Street. I think we got cheated. I don't think it's right. And to sit here and talk about 4-inch depth of windows and 1-foot balconies, that wall that north elevation would be a disaster, and to stand out in front of the driveway of the Walker McCarthy Mansion at 5 feet above the ground and take a picture, which proves that you can't see that building, is beyond absurd. You know, this is an important street, and it's very important, I think, that the backdrop to these historic buildings be paid attention to. I don't think we would sit here, or this council would sit here, this commission would sit here, and for one moment consider the same thing for the governor's mansion, the David Keith mansion, but it's the same. I will submit a card. Thank you.
Next up, Orlando Luna. After that, Monique Carlson. Mr. Luna? Monique Carlson.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak. So it's really interesting to be sitting in a historic building with a historic commission talking about two historic groups and the preservation of which. So one is encroaching upon the other. It just seems so strange to me. That said, because I am before the Historic Commission, I would like to speak about the height of the north side of the building as well. It is very much a space. The South Temple is a grand boulevard. It is one of the last, it is one of the few areas to come to. And I agree, the photo doesn't do justice to the situation that is actually going to transpire with the height of this building. That's my chief argument at the moment, is the height of this building. The straight sheer north wall massing, there will be basically a sore wound for a long time. If forever. It totally ruins the view. And I know views, and I know we're in the situation where we're building, and that's a big parking lot, and it stands to be built. I get it. And, I think we need to be sensitive and take a moment and really acknowledge that north side and the height of it. And again, thank goodness there's concessions being made on the west side and the south side. However, when you go walk through that space, you realize the impact is much greater than the pictures will show. The angles tilted on the camera and the diagrams are helpful, but it's also shocking. And I finally want to say I work at the McCune Mansion. It is very important to me to help facilitate historic values moving forward. I have no issue with building and growing our state at all. What I have issue with is the short-term gain for a situation that it's just, I think, ruining the relationship and the interface of that area. It's one of the last grand places that have not really been impacted on South Temple. And I think that's about it. Thank you.
Thank you. Michael Fletcher.
My name's Sean Fletcher, Michael Sean Fletcher. I am the general manager of the McCune Mansion here in Salt Lake City. I was going to also talk about the height of this building, but I think that's getting beat to death already. It's going to be sheer, it's going to be the worst thing you've ever seen. The McCune Mansion, I can say this from personal experience. The McCune Mansion has a building built right next to it. It's called the Panorama Apartments. It's a 7-story building. And when you look out to the east of of the McCune Mansion and you see this building, it is devastating. It should never have been built next to something as historic as the McCune Mansion. It's one of the finest buildings in Salt Lake City. We go back to the Walker Mansion, and it's these owners that buy these buildings and do it. They're not. The money it doesn't grow on trees. These guys do this for the love of the building. They do this for our heritage, to preserve our history. And when you guys allow things like this to be built that impede the people that have to work in these buildings, like myself, the McCarthys, we spend more time in these buildings than we do in our own homes. If somebody came to you and told you, oh, guess what? Somebody's going to build a 5-story building right on your backyard property line, what would you guys think? This is how these guys feel. They spend more time in these buildings than they do at their own homes. And we have a obligation to future heritage, to future generations, to protect these most precious buildings. This is one of the last ones on that street. There's not very many of them left. It's your job to save these. That's all I can say.
Thank you.
Any questions? I invite any one of you to come up to the McCune Mansion and see the house. I would venture to say the McCarthys would invite you to come up to the Walker Mansion and walk through and see for yourselves what this building will do to their building. It will not be a good thing.
Thank you. I have 3 cards from members of the audience who provided written comment but didn't indicate whether they want to speak. I will read the written comments into the record unless any of you want to come up. Rob Carlson, Michelle Turpin, Ken Rosema. Please, thank you. Once you sit down, tell us your name and then.
My name is Rob Carlson. I'm a big fan of history here in Utah. The historic building, I agree with a lot of what's been said here as far as preserving South Temple. We do need to grow. We need to have, new buildings. There is infrastructure. I understand where the Masonic Temple's coming from, that they need a secure future for themselves. But when you really look at this plan, that north side is going to be a big eyesore. And I think it could be shifted, it could be moved, it could be adjusted, and to sit down and work on that would be critical. That's basically it. Thank you.
Thank you. Michelle, would you like to come up? Tell us your name and then into the mic.
Okay. So I'm a little bit confused. I've heard that you guys are considering this project and the huge, enormous size of it because there's this desperate need for housing downtown. And I'm confused because I have a couple rental properties on Douglas Street right below the U, and I've tried to get approval to put a new garage with a little tiny casita. And I've been turned down and told that because it will not be within the guidelines of history, and because there wasn't one there before, and it might obstruct the neighbors, that I can't add more housing in an area where there's a huge desperate need because there's a growing university. So I guess my point is I don't understand. It seems hypocritical that you guys would protect my neighbors in a rental area and not protect these amazing historical homes that people have dumped probably way more money than what they're ever going to be worth into just for the sake of preserving history. That's it.
Thank you. Ken Rosema. I'll just read. For sake of education and enlightenment purposes, let's say the opposition is 25 to 1 or 100 to 1 in opposition versus support. I ask you, the commission specifically, what does it take for the community to have a voice that carries the weight in power as the developer? What would it take? I've seen the plans. The massive structure looks like a sore thumb. I look forward to your response. You okay with me continuing to read? that appropriate? Okay. Sandra McCarthy says, if there have to be Masonic apartments, they should be behind the Masonic temple, since it's their big idea. Patrick Egbert, I'm concerned about traffic and the added traffic exiting the proposed project from 600 East across South Temple. 600 East is a one-lane road with a traffic barrier. This will back up dramatically and cause issues between 6th East and South Temple. People will try to turn left across South Temple, and that raises safety concerns. I think the project would be better to exit on 7th East because it is a right-hand turn onto a much larger road designed and built for more traffic. Molly Spain, please do not let another high-rise ruin the character of historic South Temple. And then just two more. Seth Spain, please do not the historical buildings on South Temple with high-rise buildings. And Gary Evershed, I think a traffic study is needed. Lot consolidation, general appearance in keeping of historic nature of the area. Is there anyone else that would like to speak to this agenda item? Sir, come on up. We'll have you do a card afterward, but sit down and tell us your name.
MC Rivetti, and I'd like to speak in favor of the project. There's been the idea brought up over and over that South Temple is being destroyed. No buildings are being taken down. No buildings are being affected as far as the structure goes. And as far as view goes, it's a faulty premise that it's damaging the historical nature of the buildings. All across the valley, buildings have been put up over the last 50 years that have obstructed the view of somebody who had a historic building at some point, right? If we continue to block buildings being put up that aren't damaging any historic building that's at present in that place, we're going to halt the progress of our community. I mean, we all know that housing is an issue. It's been spoken of by a couple of people. And on top of that, like, we have to continue to allow progress to occur as long as it doesn't affect those buildings that are there that are historic nature. We want to, all of us want to protect the historic nature of those buildings that are in the historic districts. And so this project doesn't affect those buildings as far as the structure goes themselves. They're not being damaged, they're not being harmed, and it's going to help bring a higher class of people to the area. They're going to help preserve it and bring in good people instead of something potentially going up in the future where houses in the area continue to fall apart and bring in other people who create vandalism and other things like that. This project helps preserve the historic district. It doesn't detract from it or destroy it. And so this belief that view is almighty compared to everything else is ridiculous. And so at some point we have to take into consideration the preservation of the historic district in other terms than view. The economic factor that this will bring in will also help preserve the historic district because of the people that will be there, and will help revitalize the area and bring in perhaps other people to preserve other parts and make them higher area, bring in higher income people as well. So thank you.
Thank you. Is there anyone else that would like to speak?
Can I address the gentleman's concern?
No, we don't do a back and forth between the members of the audience.
Gateway to address that. That's
Could-
how we should go. We built that project.
We don't, yeah, let's.
You read my card, but I just wanted to add some.
Oh, please come on up and tell us your name.
My name is Patrick Egbert. I represent the Cumming family. They own the Keith Brown Mansion and the block directly west of the Governor's Mansion. I want to voice my opposition and really focus on two areas. The first area is the traffic study. I don't know if the city considered the two large projects within a block of here that are under construction right now that will also add significant traffic to South Temple. We sit on the corner between F Street and G Street in South Temple, and there's multiple accidents that we witness from our building every year because of traffic, and reiterating the point of exiting from 6th East instead of 7th. 7th East is built for large traffic. I would also want to bring up the point of compromise from the developer and the Masonic Temple organization. They've done a lot of things to try to accommodate that. The only reason they had to not put it behind their own building was that their people would have to walk through the parking lot a little bit longer. I think that in itself, if the building is right behind theirs, solves most of the issues that are discussed tonight, and that should be highly considered from their standpoint.
Thank you. We had one more card submitted, Ray Hulse.
Hi. I'd like to talk about the opposition to the development of 1082 South Blair Street. I've lived on this block for at least 50 years. So I've seen more of what goes on in that block than anybody. I've lived there the longest. And through the time that I've lived there, I see a lot of problems. And if I could talk to neighbors, if they were still here, some are still here, but one of the problems is the alley. It becomes kind of a nest, a hangout when people want to commit crime or, just have a free-for-all. I've seen, for example, right across the alley from me, somebody brought a couch out, and it was out in the alley, and it was coming from the apartments. Now, the reason I can comment on this is because the one place that people were accessing, other than to just go to into their driveways, was the apartments, which would be to the right. If you go straight across and you go to the right, there's the apartments. And the apartment, not the, well, I don't know, we call them apartments, I guess, but they're like 3 units there. And my observation, I've had people tell me, well, I used to live there, and there was a big raid there. People were having a huge drug raid that went halfway around the block. It was from Harvard, Herbert, around that way, because he was talking about this specific corner, and into that apartment building. But I guess the issue is this, is the fact that in that area, I have some personal reason in doing that, in opposing it. One is my house sits next to the alley, so I'm actually more intimate, which goes on in that alley. And you'll hear yelling and fighting and all kinds of stuff going on there. And that's not to say there aren't good people. People go into those units, and they, some of them are nice people, but you get anybody that's bad, and it just becomes a place where there's no way, for people to see what's going on. It's a kind of a hiding place. If you wanted to create a place where drugs and anything else would go on, it would be in that area. And
if I could just ask you to come to a closure, that'd be great. Thank you.
Say again?
We're over our 2 minutes. If you could just wrap up, that would be terrific.
Oh, okay. The other thing is, like, my neighbor says, well, we've never had rats here before. And it says, well, it's those dumpsters from the apartments. Well, if you build another development that goes access from the back, you've got another situation, for garbage and other stuff that's going on. I don't know how the garbage is going to be maintained to that area. But it's just, if there's anything that would create a ghetto, it's putting developments down an alley where there's a lot of crime and stuff goes on, and it becomes a hiding place. And so that's what I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you. Just want to confirm we've accommodated everyone. Terrific. Well, why don't we allow the developer to come on back up, and we'll do 5 minutes of response.
Sorry, bear with me a second. I didn't realize I took this out. I just want to... I certainly appreciate anyone who's willing to come out and speak and share their thoughts and is passionate about their property and what they do. I know that it takes heart, it takes passion to do that, and I appreciate that. As of about 2 o'clock, the last I saw, I know there's emails and massive letters in opposition. You have a packet that has an overwhelming amount of written letters in support of this project. Contrary to what anyone might believe, I can tell you that great deference was taken as we looked at this building. It wasn't to give the pinky finger or any other finger to the property owners to the north. I think there are multiple things that allude to that. We could have brought the building back the 6 feet that just to accommodate the drive, and then brought the building back to the setback. I think we could have gone with less articulation. I want to correct what was said. The window reveals are a 4-inch articulation at the window, but there are also 2.5 and 5 foot fenestration articulation changes on that north facade. It's not a solid plane. I was corrected by my legal counsel and being reminded part of the reason we did not get an access out to 7th East is because the zone is a different zone, and a access through one zone cannot go to a different zone. That was something that I didn't know, that we learned in our DRT with the city. And they call it the shopping center effect. They don't want someone owning a shopping center, buying a couple of homes, creating an access into that shopping center through a residential zone or something else to a different zone. We learned that at the DRT. Part of the reason in the rezone, the alley adjacent to the temple was rezoned. Now to the standards. Again, or the standards and some of the deference. Stepping the entirety of the west facade back, that 35 feet at a 2-story level, is part of the deference that was paid to the Walker McCarthy Mansion. Did I call it the wrong name? Yes. I hope you also noticed other people who spoke on their behalf called it the wrong name. Did we write the Broadway at Eccles? We did. We looked at a Google map. It's not because I profess to be a massive historian. I apologize for that. But great deference was paid to all adjacent properties in creating a developable site that was equal parts separated from historic structures. Our response to the standard, which you have, and I don't know who in the audience may or may not have read all of it, it's 85 pages. We responded to every standard that's required for this. Light is not a standard. View is not a standard. The items that are standards for new construction inside of a historic district were responded to. And lastly, I want to talk about the parking lot. The reason that the eastern half of the parking lot wasn't looked at for development is it is a totally different underlying zone. It's institutional. The western half of this parking lot, if you go back to the zoning maps, more than half of it was already zoned RO. Changing all of the frontage along 600 East, with the exception of a drive aisle, was already zoned RO. The extension of the RO rezone squared that off, A lot consolidation application is in with the city, consolidating the lots, making this a single parcel for development that fits these standards. But the RO zone already existed. It existed to the 60 feet of height already. We're conceding 40 feet of height in the front massive portion of this building, a great deal of which is seen from or seen over from the Walker McCarthy mansion. We're not adding a story to further impact the Simnani office building. Great deference was taken as we looked at all four sides of this building, contrary to what anyone might believe. If there's any questions from the commission, I'm happy to answer them. Otherwise, we responded to the standards. We have a staff report that's 90-something pages long with a recommendation for a certificate of appropriateness for new construction, and we would respectfully request that you approve this matter. Thank you for your time.
Okay, at this point, we'll close the public portion of the hearing, and I would love to hear any discussion that members of the commission would like to offer.
I'd like to clarify. We've heard a wide range of objections. What we are considering are the criteria listed for us here at the end, correct?
I'm sure Wayne and Paul can speak to that, but that's entirely correct. Things that lie outside of that, such as traffic studies, light, view, that's outside our purview. Sure, sorry about that. Victoria asked whether our consideration was limited to the application of the design standards and guidelines under the Historic Preservation Ordinance, and my answer was yes, that is correct. And there have been things that have been raised here tonight that are just well beyond our purview, and those include traffic, view, access to light. Those are just not relevant aspects of the historic preservation standards.
The standards in the ordinance are the only things you can consider.
Stan, do you have?
The only comment I have, listening to all this, and as some of these people know, and maybe some in the audience, I'm a Abbott Avenue, South Temple person from way, way back. And I feel bad because everybody doesn't think a north face of this building looks good, and I may be one of them. But somebody asked a question that was read about how many people have to speak out against something like this to have the public carry the day. And I don't know the answer to that, but I think the answer might resemble thousands may speak out against it, but they can't change the legal basis and things of that we are constrained by to have to give these gentlemen who have their money and their plans and their future and invested in this thing and have responsibilities to their people. We have to allow them to do what they have the right to do as a landowner. And unfortunately, beauty is in the eye of the beholder, but it isn't, as we've learned, it isn't a standard that they necessarily, nor thousands of us who disagree with them, have control over. They have the right in a lot of times, if they conform to the specifications and the standards and the city approves it, then I think we're somewhat tied no matter how many people don't like it.
Jessica or Esther, Rocio?
Mr. Chair, can I just make a point of clarification just
Yeah,
for the
of course.
record? One comment was made that access to light was not necessarily something to consider. I do want to just point out there is a design objective. It's not, the way that these work is that there's the zoning ordinance standards for review, which is what you are charged with reviewing and making a determination of whether or not it meets those standards. We also have what are called design objectives. Those are things that kind of help in deciding these things, but they're all kind of made with a should, because in some aspects it may or may not work. But I do want to just point out, just because some statements were made that the access to light isn't something that's considered, there is a design objective that says new multifamily buildings should be designed to respect access to light and the privacy of adjacent buildings. I just want to make sure that that's on the record and considered.
Thank you for the correction.
Wayne, and for the purpose of my own understanding, those standards are listed in the far left column here.
That's correct.
The objectives are listed in the middle, and unless evidence that contradicts what the staff has presented to us and what the developers have, which is in this rightmost column, it would be outside of the Historic Landmark Commission purview to not grant the certificate of appropriateness, correct?
Well, the staff's role in this is to review the project and provide our recommendation. You're not required to follow that. But it's a guidance. It's something, here's the information, we've reviewed this, but it is the HLC's responsibility to make the findings on those standards. Does that help?
Well, I had one just procedural question, which is we've had either one or two work sessions on this project, right? Are those noticed out the same way to the neighbors in the same way that public meetings are? They are. Well, to me, it's unfortunate that we've landed where we have. There have been some opportunities to really engage long before we got to this, it seems like, have been missed. So that's unfortunate. Anything else?
I'll say something. So I would just like to echo what Stan, discussed, and you couldn't have said that any better. But at the same time, I'm also wondering if developers, you're going to have a relationship with the adjacent properties. Moving forward, you have to have a plan in place because there's a lot of tension, and it's not going to go away. So that's something that you will have to work somehow to address because this relationship is going to be a long-term relationship. And I'd hate to see the neighbors upset for, a long time. And this has nothing to do with my view on the project. It is a great project. And it's a good thing that's being placed in that section. So, but at the same time, there's that other part that you will have to work on.
Well, does anyone, would anyone like to make a motion if there's no further comment?
So I will go ahead and motion. Please. Okay. Based on an analysis and findings in the staff report that the standards for approval of a certificate of appropriateness involving new construction in a local historic district have been substantially met, testimony and proposal presented, I move that the commission approve the request for new construction located at approximately 33 South, 600 East.
Is there a second?
Middle button.
I'll second that.
Jessica, would you lead us off?
Yes.
Yes.
Petro Eschler, aye.
Stoll, aye.
Torres Mora, aye.
The motion passes unanimously. Do I have a appeal language you want me to read? Or perhaps you would do the honors?
If anybody who is aggrieved by a decision of the Historic Landmark Commission may appeal that decision to the city's appeals hearing officer within 30 days of the issuance of a decision in this matter.
Do we have a motion to recess?
I'll make it.
All in favor? Aye. Okay, we're in recess.
Let me correct that. It's 30 if the applicant. It's 10 days to appeal if it's anybody other than the applicant. So sorry. The information's on the agenda for appealing.
Thank you. We are recessed.
I feel like my tires might get soft.
Gotta read a book sometime.